Mr. President, everybody knows that our country has an $850 billion deficit and a $16+ trillion national debt. But what has not been discussed as often as it should is how we came into that financial position. How do we have the deficit and how do we have this huge debt? Let us not forget, as we discuss this issue, that in January of 2001, when President Bill Clinton left office, this country had an annual federal budget surplus of $236 billion. Surplus of $236 billion in January 2001. We now have an $850 billion deficit. What happened? Well, I think many Americans know what happened. When you go to war in Afghanistan and Iraq and you don't pay for those wars, you add to the deficit. When you give huge tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country and you don't offset that, you add to the deficit. When you pass a Medicare Part D prescription drug program, you don't pay for that, you add to the deficit. And on top of all of that, we must understand that right now, at 15.8% of GDP, revenue coming into the federal government is the lowest that it has been in 60 years. And the reason for that is that we are in the midst of a very serious recession, a recession caused by the greed, recklessness, and illegal behavior on Wall Street. And not only has that led to significant increases in unemployment and businesses going under, once again, it resulted in less tax revenue coming in to this government. And by the way, Mr. President, when we talk about Wall Street and the greed and the recklessness and illegal behavior on Wall Street, I must say that I was really stunned when the Attorney General of the United States recently suggested that it might be difficult to prosecute Wall Street CEOs who commit crimes because of the destabilizing effect that prosecution might have on the financial system of our country and the world. In other words, we have a situation now where Wall Street is not only too big to fail, they are too big to jail. And the theory is that if you're just a regular person, you commit a crime, you go to jail. You're head of a Wall Street company. Your power is so great, the tentacles of that company are so great, that if you are prosecuted and there's destabilization in that company, it can have worldwide or national implications. Mr. President, that is an issue we have got to think long and hard about. We are supposed to be a country of law, and that law should apply to the CEOs of Wall Street companies as well as everybody else. Mr. President, the other point I want to make deals, if you want, with a moral issue. When you're dealing with deficit reduction, I've just described how we got into the deficit situation. But when you're dealing with the deficit situation and you say we need to make sacrifices, it is absolutely appropriate and ask who is best able to make those sacrifices. And right now, as I think most Americans know, the wealthiest people in this country are doing phenomenally well. Large corporations are enjoying record-breaking profits. That's one group of people. Meanwhile, the middle class of this country is disappearing, and we have 46 million people living in poverty. So common morality, basic morality says, who do you ask most significantly to help us with deficit reduction? Do you tell an unemployed worker who is struggling to keep his or her family afloat that we're going to balance the budget on your back? Or do you say maybe to a huge profitable corporation that in some cases is paying nothing in taxes that, you know what, we're going to ask you to help us with deficit reduction? Now, Mr. President, it is important for us to do what we do too rarely on the floor of the Senate. Take a hard look at what's happening to the American people right now. I am very pleased we're seeing more job creation. Good thing. We're seeing somewhat of a recovery in housing. Very good thing. But let us understand where the middle class of this country is today, where the working class of this country is today, before we demand that we balance the budget on their backs as the Ryan budget in the House does. Mr. President, since 1999, the average middle-class family have seen its income go down by nearly $5,000 after adjusting for inflation. Median family income today is lower than it was in 1996. Real unemployment is not 7.7%. It is 14.3% if you count those people who have given up looking for work and are working part-time. Youth unemployment is even higher. More than 25% of young Americans are unemployed. In terms of the African-American community, unemployment is off the charts. Mr. President, when we talk about job creation, we all want job creation. It is important, however, to understand that nearly 60% of the new jobs that have been created since 2010 are low-wage jobs, paying between $7.80 an hour and $13.80 an hour. Jobs, yes, but we want jobs that families can take care of their families on, not just low-wage jobs. Further, Mr. President, when we are talking about the budget, and we don't talk about this at all, I know that my Republican friends don't talk about it, most of my Democratic friends don't talk about it. It's anathema here to talk about issues of distribution of wealth and income, but I think it is important before we talk about on whose backs we're going to balance the budget. Today, the United States has the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth, and the gap between the very, very wealthy and everyone else is growing wider and wider. Incredibly, the wealthiest 400 individuals in this country today own more wealth than the bottom half of America, 150 million people. Now, Mr. President, I think that's an issue we might want to discuss, even if it offends some of our wealthy campaign contributors. But I think we should put that on the table. Today, one family, the Walton family of Walmart, owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of families in this country. And by the way, you'll all be delighted to know they got a huge tax break recently. Today, the top 1% owns 38% of all financial wealth. That is a stunning number. What is even more stunning is the bottom 60% own 2.3% of the wealth in this nation. 1% on top owns 38% of the wealth. Bottom 60% owns 2.3%. And who does Mr. Ryan and my Republican friends want to balance the budget on? Those 60%, the working families who already have nothing, who are losing what they have, who are struggling to keep their heads above water. But it's not just distribution of wealth, it's distribution of income. If you can believe it, this is just, again, a stunning fact, which for some reason we don't talk about too much here on the floor. A recent study showed that all, ALL, all of the new income gain from 2009 to 2011 went to the top 1%. 99% gain, nothing. So who do we balance the budget on? Well, of course, you go after the middle class, go after the working class, go after low-income people. Well, maybe, somebody might want to ask that 1% to start paying a little bit more in taxes before we cut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, and nutrition. Mr. President, one of the good parts of the Murray budget is that it provides $100 billion in funding to put millions of Americans back to work, rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure. I would have gone much higher, because while deficit reduction is a very serious issue, it is even more important that we start putting millions of people back to work who are in desperate need of employment. Fastest way to do that is to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. $100 billion is a good start. We need more. Now, Mr. President, during the consideration of the budget resolution, I plan on offering two amendments. The first amendment, number 264, would create a reserve fund to reduce the deficit and create jobs by eliminating offshore tax abuse by large, profitable corporations. The second amendment, amendment number 198, would establish a deficit-neutral reserve fund to protect the benefits of disabled veterans, and I speak as chairman of the Veterans Committee, disabled vets and their survivors, by not enacting the so-called Chained CPI, and I'm pleased that this amendment is being co-sponsored by Senator Harkin and Senator Hirono. And let me take a few minutes to describe both of these amendments. Mr. President, at a time when corporate profits are at an all-time high, when the effective corporate tax rate is at a 40-year low, when 1 out of 4 profitable corporations pay 0 in taxes, it is time for large, profitable corporations to significantly contribute to deficit reduction. Now, the first amendment that I'll be offering would create a reserve fund to reduce the deficit and create jobs by eliminating offshore tax abuse by large, profitable corporations. Mr. President, in 2011, corporate revenue as a percentage of GDP was just 1.2%. That is lower than any other major country in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Lower than Britain, Germany, France, Japan, Canada, you name it. Each and every year, corporations and the wealthy are avoiding more than $100 billion in U.S. taxes by sheltering their income offshore. Offshore tax schemes have become so absurd that one 5-story building in the Cayman Islands is now the quote-unquote home to more than 18,000 corporations. Mr. President, when the Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Citigroup needed a taxpayer bailout in 2008, and I did not vote for that bailout, they told us what great Americans they were, how much they loved the United States of America, proud to be an American. But when it comes to paying their taxes, these large Wall Street companies are proud to be with the Cayman Islands. So my suggestion to these corporations, next time you need a bailout, don't come to the taxpayers of America, go to the people of the Cayman Islands and get your bailout there. But so long as you're an American company, how about helping us with deficit reduction and paying some taxes in this country? But it's not just Wall Street. You got pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly and Pfizer also using offshore tax havens. Apple wants all the advantages of being an American company, but it doesn't want to pay American taxes or American wages. It creates the iPad, the iPhone, the iPod, iTunes in the United States, manufactures most of its products in China, and then it ships most of its profits to Ireland, Luxembourg, the British Virgin Islands, and other tax havens to avoid paying U.S. taxes. Mr. President, this is a huge issue. By the way, it's not just an American issue. It is an issue facing governments all over the world. Corporations run to tax havens, Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and elsewhere. We have got to address that issue. Mr. President, I'm going to list for the record, submit to the record, 15 large, profitable corporations that have used offshore tax havens to avoid paying U.S. income taxes in recent years. Top of the list, I'm going to give you just one example. Bank of America. 2010, Bank of America set up more than 200 subsidiaries in the Cayman Islands to avoid paying U.S. taxes. It worked. Not only did Bank of America pay nothing in federal income taxes, but it received a rebate from the IRS for $1.9 billion that year. Now, before you cut Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare, do you think maybe we might want to ask Bank of America, who we bailed out, by the way, to help us with deficit reduction? General Electric, during the last 5 years, General Electric made $81 billion in profits. Not only has General Electric avoided paying federal income taxes during these years, it received a tax rebate of $3 billion from the IRS. GE has at least 14 offshore subsidiaries in Bermuda, Singapore, and Luxembourg. Citigroup, Verizon, Honeywell International, J.P. Morgan Chase, Merrick, Corning, Boeing, Goldman Sachs, Microsoft, Caterpillar, Cisco Systems, Dow Chemicals, major profitable corporations using tax havens to avoid paying in the United States of America. We have an amendment to deal with that issue, and I hope we can have bipartisan support for that amendment. Now, Mr. President, I want to talk about my second amendment, and now I speak as chairman of the Veterans Committee. This amendment, number 198, would establish a deficit-neutral reserve fund to protect the benefits of disabled veterans and their survivors by not enacting the so-called Chained CPI. And I'm pleased that this amendment is being co-sponsored by Senators Harkin and Hirono. Mr. President, the time has come for the Senate to send a very loud and clear message to the American people. We will not balance the budget on the backs of disabled veterans who have lost their arms, their legs, and their eyesight defending our country. We will not balance the budget on the backs of the men and women who have already sacrificed for us in Iraq and Afghanistan, nor on the widows who have lost their husbands in Iraq and Afghanistan defending our country. And we will not balance the budget on the backs of those who served so valiantly in World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and other conflicts by cutting Social Security benefits. We will not adopt the Chained CPI. Mr. President, Madam President, the Chained CPI is forcefully opposed by every major veterans organization in this country. And I've talked to many of them, and they are outraged that after the sacrifices veterans have made, that people want to balance the budget on their backs. And all of the veterans organizations are in opposition to the Chained CPI, and it includes, of course, the American Legion, the VFW, the Disabled American Veterans, the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, Gold Star Wives, DAV, you name the veterans organizations, and they are in opposition. But it's not just the veterans organizations who opposed the Chained CPI. Chained CPI is opposed by every major senior citizen group in this country, including the AARP, the largest senior group. And I understand they've been calling up members of the Senate and the House, and I hope members will listen to what the AARP has to say, the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, and the Alliance for Retired Americans. The Chained CPI is opposed by every major union in this country, and I had a press conference not so long ago with Rich Trumka of the AFL-CIO. They are strongly opposed to this Chained CPI. The Chained CPI is opposed by every major disability group in this country. It is opposed by the National Organization for Women because they understand what the Chained CPI would mean for women. Mr. President, Madam President, there are some who believe that lowering cost of living adjustments, COLAs, through the adoption of a Chained CPI would be just a minor tweak in benefits. But let's be clear. For millions of disabled veterans and seniors living on fixed incomes, the Chained CPI is not a minor tweak. It is a significant benefit cut that will make it harder for permanently disabled veterans and the elderly to feed their families, heat their homes, pay for their prescription drugs, and make ends meet. This misguided proposal must be vigorously opposed. You know, in one moment or another, everybody here is talking about how they want to save Social Security because they know back home that Social Security is enormously popular. Poll after poll, whether you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, what people are saying is don't cut Social Security. Don't cut benefits for disabled veterans. Well, now we're going to give members on both sides of the aisle the opportunity to act on what they have been saying for many, many years. Now, supporters of the Chained CPI want the American people to believe that the COLAs that disabled vets, senior citizens, and the surviving spouses and children who have lost loved ones in combat, they're too generous. So any senior citizen who is listening to this, the theory behind the Chained CPI is the benefits that you have been getting is too generous. And whenever I say this in Vermont, people start laughing. They really do. And I have to say, no, they're not kidding. They're really serious. Now, at a time when some think these benefits are too serious, we should understand that in 2 out of the last 4 years, disabled vets and senior citizens did not receive any COLA at all, zero. So I guess a zero COLA is too generous, too generous. And this year's COLA of 1.7% is one of the lowest ever at a time when prescription drug costs for seniors going up, health care costs for seniors going up, heating costs in cold weather states like mine going up, food costs going up, and yet seniors got a 1.7% COLA, and there are people who say, oh, that's much too generous. Madam President, today more than 3.2 million disabled vets receive disability compensation benefits from the VA and would be negatively impacted by the Chained CPI. Are you really ready? After all of the great speeches we hear, the speeches of thank you to the veterans who put their lives on the line, who gave their lives defending this country, you really want to cut benefits to those people who lost their arms and their legs, their eyesight? I hope not. Mr. President, Madam President, under the Chained CPI, a disabled veteran who started receiving VA disability benefits at age 30 would have their benefits cut by more than $1,400 at age 45, $2,300 at age 55, and $3,200 at age 65. Now, for our Wall Street friends, the people who make millions of dollars a year, that's not a lot of money. But for people who are trying to survive on $20,000, $25,000, $15,000 a year, that is a big hit. And in my view, if you respect veterans and the sacrifices they have made, if you respect the greatest generation and what they have done to make this country great, you don't balance the budget on their backs. Let me just conclude by saying that I have been to Walter Reed, and I have seen what war has done to veterans, and many of my colleagues have done the same. In Vermont, we paid a very, very heavy price in the Iraq War, and I've been to too many funerals, and I know many of my colleagues have done the same. And I just ask, Madam President, that before we support this so-called Chained CPI, which will make devastating cuts on the backs of disabled veterans and senior citizens, we remember the sacrifices that those people made. And, Madam President, what I would like is to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record statements from the American Legion in opposition to the Chained CPI, and what Jim Coots, who is the National Commander of the American Legion, says, and he says, and I quote, "On behalf of the 2.4 million members of the American Legion, I voice our opposition to the Chained CPI because of the harmful effects it will have on veterans." And he goes on in greater detail. I also want to enter into the record a letter that I received from the Executive Director of the Disabled American Veterans, Barry Jezanowski, and he writes, and I quote, "On behalf of all disabled veterans and their families, we stand with you in firm opposition to the application of the Chained CPI to disability and pension payments for veterans, dependents, and survivors of veterans." And I would like to enter that that letter into the record.
Without objection.
And Madam President, I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letters I received from the veterans of foreign wars, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, the Blinded Veterans Association, the Gold Star Wives, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, Vietnam Veterans of America, and several other veterans groups who, in one letter, they came together to write me a letter, and this is what they said. "As efforts to address," and I quote, "as efforts to address our nation's debt continue, we are writing to express our opposition to changing the formula used to calculate the annual cost of living adjustments because of the harmful effects it will have on veterans and Social Security benefits. We agree that political leaders need to restore fiscal discipline, but we believe it should be done with great care and without reneging on this country's promise to veterans, including the promises of Social Security and VA disability compensation and pension benefits, all of which are modest in size." And that's a letter that comes to me from the VFW, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, Blinded Veterans Association, Gold Star Wives, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, and Vietnam Veterans of America. And I would ask unanimous consent to submit that letter to the record.
Without objection.
So here we are. Madam President, we're in the deficit situation because of wars that were unpaid for, tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country, Medicare Part D not paid for, and a recession caused by Wall Street. And now we have folks who are saying, well, yeah, we got a serious deficit problem, and I agree. And the way we're going to do it is make devastating cuts on the backs of some of the most vulnerable people in this country, including disabled vets and including people who receive Social Security and disability benefits. I don't think that's the moral thing to do. I don't think that's the economically appropriate thing to do. When you have 1 out of 4 major corporations, huge corporations, profitable corporations, paying 0 in taxes, when the corporate tax rate today, the effective corporate tax rate, is the lowest that it has been in decades, when the gap between the very, very wealthy and everybody else is growing wider. Madam President, there are ways to do deficit reduction that are fair. And I will do everything that I can to make sure that as we go forward with deficit reduction, we do it in a way that is fair and not on the backs of some of the most vulnerable people in this country. With that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.